The other part of thinking and intelligence is intelligence. And the question is, what is intelligence? When you think of intelligence, you think of what does it mean to be smart? Well, what is that? What does it mean to have intelligence? What does it mean to be smart? A number of theorists have presented views, and there's a number of tests that attempt to measure intelligence, and that's kind of what we're going to talk about, because intelligence, or the way that you think, or how well you think, is going to have an effect on your behavior. Again, psychology, the study of human behavior. So, when you talk about intelligence, the first thing is people often divide intelligence into two parts. They divide intelligence into crystallized intelligence and fluid intelligence. Crystallized intelligence is that storehouse of information you have. If you are an expert chess player, then you know all the different chess moves. Then you know, for instance, how the different pieces move. You know the different patterns. That would be some crystallized intelligence. If you are a chemist, you know the atomic structure of all the different elements. That's crystallized intelligence. Fluid intelligence is sort of as you go. It's problem solving in the moment. It's in the moment thinking and how you solve problems. That's fluid intelligence. They're separated primarily because when you look at aging and IQ, the crystallized part of intelligence people have for a long time. It's the fluid part that tends to deteriorate with age first. Okay, so that's crystallized versus fluid. We also look at general theories of intelligence. The first and oldest is what we call General G. General G is an idea that intelligence is this overarching thinking ability. It's this idea that people have this general thinking, problem-solving ability that's overarching above multiple domains. That's General G. Proponents of General G would argue that if people are good at one thing, they tend to be good at other things. People that are good at math and science also tend to score high in reading and language. That's their evidence. Other people disagree with that. A guy named Sternberg came in and said, I don't believe in General G. I think intelligence is made up of three big components: practical, analytical, and creativity. So we have practical intelligence, which is the everyday problem solving in the real world. That's practical intelligence. Can you deal with people? Can you solve problems in everyday life? That would be what some people would call street smarts and practical intelligence. There's also analytical intelligence, or in some books call it componential. This is what a lot of people would call book smarts. So if you think of Sheldon from Big Bang Theory, then you can think of somebody who has a lot of analytical intelligence, but not as much practical intelligence. Okay? So analytical intelligence would be like book smarts, people that have high levels of school type skills. So we have practical intelligence, analytical intelligence, and the last component of Sternberg's theory is creativity. People who can think of novel ways to do things. Those are the three aspects that he thinks of as intelligence. So we have General G, we have Sternberg, then we have a guy named Howard Gardner who came in and said, I really do not like General G theory. I dislike it so much that I don't think there even is such a thing as intelligence. I think there are intelligences. So he developed the theory of what he called multiple intelligences. He thinks that people have a number of different abilities that he would call intelligences, and they are not necessarily related to one another. He started out with 7 and have since added a few more. His original 7 he acknowledged some of the school type. He's linguistic, logical, mathematical, and spatial. He acknowledged kind of 3 of the school type. Then he decided, well, I'm going to acknowledge some that Sternberg would call practical. Interpersonal, okay? Intrapersonal, in other words, dealing with other people and then knowing yourself. And then the other 2 are kind of out there. Musical intelligence was another one of his original ones. People that have that natural ability to hear pitches and sort of, they don't even have to know how to read music. They can just listen to something and recreate it. Natural musicians. That musical intelligence. And his other one was bodily kinesthetic. And this was the most controversial. He basically said that people who have this ability to just naturally know where their body is in space and ability to move their bodies in specific ways and control their body movements, that is a type of intelligence, sort of natural athletes. So that's Gardner. Gardner basically said that there are, and he has since added other ones onto that, but he said there are intelligences. So those are the theories. Other than that, there is a new trend toward this thing called emotional intelligence. People that are able to read other people's emotions. People that would be really good salespeople, politicians, managers. They're really able to read other people and what other people want and need and react to that. Now, with power comes great responsibility. Having good emotional intelligence, and it also gives this component of being manipulative, and the fact that, and I guess any intelligence you could use for good or for bad. So the last thing when you talk about sort of types of intelligence or what intelligence is creativity. Creativity is this coming up with novel ideas or novel ways to do things, and is that related to traditional intelligence? Well, yes, but not perfectly. There's a relationship. In other words, people that are creative also tend to have decent levels of traditional intelligence. Typically. Is it absolutely necessary? No. But there's a correlation. It typically is there, because part of measuring traditional intelligence is the ability to see connections between things. And people who are highly creative do that. They see connections between things, even connections between things that normal people would not see. So, creativity is something that is related to intelligence. In fact, some people, like Sternberg, would say it's a specific component. But it's also, normally people who are creative have a level of intelligence. Okay, so that's what intelligence is. How do we measure it? Well, first of all, we need to figure out what IQ is and what's the history of it. IQ is another word for intelligence quotient, and it is today on a scale where typical IQ tests, the average is 100 with a standard deviation of around 15. In other words, most people, if you get a random sample of people in the United States, most people would have an IQ somewhere between 85 and 115. Okay, depending on where you go. Like I know I worked in a suburban school district with a lot of kids from families which were college educated. So they had a lot of what Sternberg would call book smarts. The typical IQs are more in the higher end of that. The 110 range is more of the average. Okay. Now, if you go to an area where people don't traditionally do academically very well, the average is going to be more like 90. So overall, between 85 and 115, intelligence is related to school ability. That's the history of IQ. There was a guy named Binet in France who was asked to develop a test to give red flags to spot kids that would not do well in the normal school system. So when IQ was developed, it was developed to be a measure of academic ability. And essentially what you find today is expanded a little bit, but traditional IQ tests do measure the aspects of intelligence that tend to be related to academic type abilities. They measure short-term memory, vocabulary, number skills, spatial, they measure some spatial ability. A lot of them have spatial tasks. So they measure things that relate to success in academics. They don't really get at bodily kinesthetic or music or a lot of the interpersonal stuff. So that's just what intelligence tests are. The history of IQ, again, is the guy in France who came up with a test to find kids who would not do well in the school system. Since then, IQ tests have been used for a number of things. They were used in the military to basically categorize and look at people. They're used today in Ohio. Every school system has to give children an IQ test sometime during their career, and it's generally a group administered IQ test for identification for giftedness. So today, in our school systems today, IQ tends to be used as an indicator of, primarily for the extremes. Indicator for kids who need enrichment, who are identified as gifted and may need extra, and kids who score on the low end, who may need extra in terms of extra help. So that's traditionally what it's used for, and it is very related to academic ability. It's related to the same types of mental processes that are related to school success. What are some modern IQ tests? The two most common individually administered IQ tests are the Stanford Binet, and yes, it was the original Binet IQ test, and a guy at Stanford University in California modified it over the years, and there still is a version of it. It has been really modified over time, but it is one of the individually administered IQ tests. The other popular one is the Wechsler test. There's the WISC and the WACE and the WIPSI. The WIPSI is the preschool. The WISC is the Wechsler Intelligence Scale for children, and the WACE is the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale. So he has scales for all ages. These tests kind of measure similar things. Again, they have short-term memory, verbal skills, they do things like analogies, vocabulary. They each have some kind of spatial processing speed component. So they have a lot of different components, and what you will get is an overall IQ score and then some subscores. Personally, I think the best way to use IQ tests is to get that profile. Because if you have somebody with a 110 IQ, you have two people with a 110 IQ. One person who scores 90 on one thing and 130 on another, and then another person who scores 110 right across the board. Those two people are different. One has some weaknesses and strengths and a lot of variability. The other is consistently high average. It's not good or bad. They just both have their own profiles. That's what I think the best use of IQ tests is for. Not for that overall score, but to get that take of strengths and weaknesses. And what you get is, this is how that person did on that particular date, at that particular place, at that particular time. So I think two things. One, looking at the profile, and two, not letting one IQ test be a measure of somebody for their entire life. Knowing that anything could affect it. How they're feeling, their motivation, their environment, all that could affect it. When I was in grad school, I was learning to give the preschool one, and I gave it to who was my little cousin at the time, and he was 3.5. When I dropped him off at my aunt's house, he said, and I don't know whether my memory is getting the exact words, but it was generally, Sherry gave me a test and I didn't pay attention. So I got a score, but the score probably underestimated that little kid's ability. And right now, the little kid who was 3.5 is a elementary school teacher with a decent amount of intelligence. So it again it gives you, I think, using the profile and using it as a date and time stamped measure. Okay, so we go from that to the Flynn effect in typical IQ. We already talked about extremes of intelligence. The Flynn effect is the fact that intelligence scores have gone up over time. As people are taking IQ tests, school systems train kids to take them. They know what types of items are on there, so they explicitly teach that. So kids get test savvy. So they constantly have to ramp it up. Also, IQ measures school success, measures academic type skills. People are more educated than they were 50 years ago. They have more academic skills. So the Flynn effect is the effect that IQ tests, especially in developed countries like the US, IQs have gone up over time. So we constantly have to renorm. So we have that. We talked about typical IQ. Typical IQ, the average is 100 with a standard deviation of 15. That means specifically 2/3 of people are between 85 and 115. Okay, and the other third is divided. Extremes, when you're talking about giftedness or intellectual disability, typically is 130 or above or 70 or below. In other words, 2 standard deviations above or below the mean, which means that it's the top 2.5% and the bottom 2.5%, roughly. That's the extremes. Now, in order to be identified as gifted, in Ohio, you can be identified cognitively on an IQ test. You can be identified in a specific academic measure: reading, math, science, social studies. If you take an academic test and get at the 95th percentile or above, you can be identified. For the other extreme, to be identified in terms of intellectual disability, you have to score 70 or below, plus score low on a score of adaptive behavior. In other words, add a component of that Sternberg's practical intelligence. In other words, kind of do this checklist of how does the person do on day-to-day tasks. So intellectual disability would be you score low on a traditional IQ test plus low on adaptive behavior. That's extremes of intelligence. There's really 2 other things that we want to talk about in terms of IQ. Want to talk about nature versus nurture and group differences. The nature versus nurture thing in IQ is actually really simple. It's both. You can talk about, is your IQ due to your genes or your environment? It's both. People are born, it's that reaction range. People are born with a range of possibilities, and their environment is going to determine where in that range of possibilities they fit. Personally, I think most people are born with a humongous range of possibilities when it comes to IQ, and their environment and their experiences are going to determine where in that range they fall. How do they know that IQ has a genetic component? Well, a lot of it comes from adoption studies, looking at the correlation of IQ. Is a person's IQ, the IQ of somebody who's been adopted, is it more correlated with their adoptive parents or their biological parents? And they do see some correlation with biological parents, with genetics. Looking at adoptions, looking at twin studies. Identical twins have very, very, very similar IQs. However, identical twins' IQs are not always exactly the same, which means there's also an environmental component. There's been studies that show that with environmental stimuli and with different programs, IQ can be raised. Environmental component. So in the end, it's both. Which leads to the next thing, group differences in IQ. Are there group differences in IQ? Gender differences? No. Males and females tend to score similar on IQ tests. If you look at specific abilities, you do see women still tending to score a little, females tending to score a little higher on verbal tests, and males, math and spatial stuff. Males still score higher in math if you look at SAT scores. And SAT, by the way, SAT and ACT are not, repeat, not IQ tests. They're tests of academic ability, not IQ tests. Okay? So anyway, gender differences, no overall differences, although there are differences in the different sub-areas. Are there cultural ethnic differences? Yes. There are still differences in IQ if you look at racial differences within the US. Okay, what does that mean? I believe that means that there are still environmental differences, that there are racial ethnic differences in the environmental stimuli that people have been given growing up, because IQ is related to school type abilities. And if people have different school type experiences, they're going to score differently on an IQ test. I think if you take out economics, specifically the environmental impact that economics has, the impact of poverty, if you take that out, those racial and ethnic differences basically disappear. So yes, there still are group differences within the U.S. and between the U.S. and other countries. A lot of that is due to economics and environmental issues. That's IQ. I find it a fascinating topic. Any questions you have, feel free.